A veteran Navy SEAL inherited a ruined greenhouse hidden deep in the forests of Montana. He planned to sell it the moment he arrived, but his German Shepherd suddenly stopped and refused to leave the broken building. Beneath the frozen glass, they uncovered a secret his grandfather spent a lifetime protecting. What began as a forgotten inheritance slowly became a place that started healing broken people. And for the first time since the war, the veteran found something stronger than his memories. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from, and please like, subscribe, and join Veteran Dog Stories tonight. Spring still carried winter's breath in northern Montana. Old snow clung stubbornly to the shadows beneath the pine trees, melting slowly under pale sunlight that never seemed warm enough to finish the job. The mountain roads were wet with thawing ice, reflecting the gray-white sky like broken mirrors scattered through the forest. Cade Whitmore drove in silence. The old Ford pickup rattled softly as it climbed another narrow curve through the mountains. A faded duffel bag sat behind the seat beside a metal toolbox, scratched by years of use. The cab smelled faintly of motor oil, damp flannel, and pine needles tracked in from old boots. In the passenger seat lay Ranger. The German Shepherd K9 rested with his head near the window, dark ears twitching at every distant sound outside. At 5 or 6 years old, Ranger still carried the disciplined posture of a working military dog. His black and tan coat was short and thick, scarred lightly near one shoulder from years beside Cade, in places neither of them liked remembering. His deep brown eyes never truly rested. Even lying down, he watched the world carefully, especially Cade. The former Navy SEAL looked older than 43 when the light hit him wrong. Broad shoulders still filled the olive field jacket stretched over his frame. But exhaustion lived permanently in the lines around his blue-gray eyes. His dark brown hair was cut short in a practical military style, silver already creeping into the temples. A rough layer of stubble shadowed his angular jaw. He looked like a man built for surviving storms, not living after them. Cade rubbed one hand over his beard as the truck rolled into the small town of Northvale. The town sat between mountains and lake water, like something forgotten by time. A diner with a flickering sign, a weathered gas station, old brick storefronts with faded paint. Smoke curled lazily from chimneys into the cold spring air. Normal, peaceful, the kind of place people moved to when they wanted quiet, or when they wanted to disappear. Cade parked beside the post office and shut off the engine. For a moment he just sat there, staring through the windshield while Ranger lifted his head. "You staying?" Cade muttered. Ranger blinked once. That was answer enough. The post office smelled like dust, old paper, and burnt coffee. Behind the counter stood a thin woman in her 60s wearing large glasses on a chain around her neck. She smiled politely when Cade entered, though her eyes lingered on the scars across his hands. "You Cade Whitmore?" she asked. He nodded once. "There's been legal mail waiting for you." She handed him a thick envelope with the county seal stamped across the front. Ranger sat near the doorway, alert but calm. Cade opened the envelope slowly. Inside was a formal notice from the county legal office informing him that Edgar Whitmore, his grandfather, had died 3 months earlier. Cade stared at the page without expression. He hadn't seen Edgar in nearly 15 years, not since one ugly argument between Edgar and Cade's father during a Christmas visit long ago. Cade still remembered the shouting through the cabin walls while snow piled outside the windows. "You care more about that damn greenhouse than your own family," his father had snapped. Edgar never defended himself. That part had always stayed with Cade. The old man had simply stood there in silence, weathered hands folded behind his back, eyes fixed somewhere beyond the frozen trees outside. Now he was gone. And somehow he had left Cade property. The legal notice described it simply: unregistered agricultural structure and surrounding land parcel. Transfer fee due, $11. Cade almost laughed. $11. That alone told him the place was probably worthless. The county office sat 2 streets over in an aging brick building beside the sheriff's station. Inside, Cade met Harold Bennett, the town's legal clerk, a heavy-set man with silver hair, suspenders, and the tired eyes of someone who had spent too many years buried in paperwork. "You're Edgar's grandson," Harold said quietly. It wasn't really a question. Cade nodded once. Harold studied him for a moment, then reached into a drawer and pulled out an old brass key darkened by age. The moment the key touched the desk, Ranger stood instantly, not barking, not growling, just suddenly alert, his ears locked forward, his body stiffened, his eyes fixed directly on the key. Cade frowned. Ranger had reacted to explosives that way before, to hidden weapons, to danger. But this? Harold noticed it too. "Well," the old clerk murmured softly, "guess dogs remember things people don't." Cade didn't like the feeling that crawled across his spine. He reached for the key anyway. The brass felt strangely cold in his hand. Then Harold slid over a hand-drawn map. "The property's deep past Miller's Lake," he explained. "Old greenhouse out there." "Greenhouse?" Cade repeated. Harold nodded. "Your grandfather spent half his life there." Cade leaned back in the chair. His father had always described Edgar like some kind of obsessed hermit living among broken glass and dead plants in the woods. A man who chose dirt over people. Cade had believed it. At least until now. Because something about the room suddenly felt wrong. Not dangerous, just unfinished. And Ranger still hadn't taken his eyes off the key. The road beyond Northvale narrowed into gravel, then eventually into little more than muddy tire tracks winding through the forest. Afternoon sunlight filtered through tall birch trees, turning their white bark gold. Patches of snow lingered beneath the shadows, while cold water rushed beside the road in shallow streams swollen with spring melt. Cade drove slowly. Ranger had moved upright now, nose near the cracked passenger window, sniffing constantly. The farther they traveled, the quieter Cade became. No traffic, no voices, only wind. It reminded him too much of certain valleys overseas before dawn patrols. Places where silence meant waiting. His jaw tightened. The truck bounced over another rut. Then suddenly Ranger let out a low sound deep in his throat. Not aggressive, focused. Cade looked ahead. At first he only saw sunlight through trees. Then the forest opened. And there it was. The greenhouse. Even from a distance it looked enormous. A massive curved structure of steel and cloudy glass, rising from the clearing like the skeleton of some forgotten cathedral. Thick ivy and wild vines swallowed nearly half the frame. Several glass panels were shattered, leaving dark holes that reflected the afternoon sky. Yet somehow it was still beautiful. Sunlight spilled through broken sections of the roof, igniting the inside with soft gold light. Wildflowers bloomed all around the clearing in scattered patches of purple and yellow. The place looked abandoned, but not dead. Cade stepped out of the truck slowly. Cold wind brushed against his jacket. For a long moment, he simply stared. Then Ranger jumped from the passenger seat and immediately began pulling toward the greenhouse, harder than usual. "Easy," Cade muttered. But the dog ignored him. That alone unsettled Cade more than he wanted to admit. Ranger was disciplined. Always. Yet now, the German Shepherd moved with strange urgency. Paws crunching across old gravel as he headed toward the front entrance covered in vines. Cade followed reluctantly. The steel doors groaned when he forced them open. Warm air drifted out. Not hot, not cold either, just strangely alive. Inside, the greenhouse felt like another world. Tall ferns and climbing vines had overtaken sections of the interior. Rusted gardening tables sat beneath shafts of sunlight pouring through dusty glass overhead. Broken ceramic pots lay scattered across the floor beside ancient watering cans and rotted wooden crates. And despite years of abandonment, there were still living plants. Cade stopped walking, something twisted unexpectedly in his chest. Because suddenly he remembered being 8 years old, kneeling beside Edgar while dirt covered both their hands. "Roots don't care who you used to be," the old man had once told him quietly. "Only whether you stay long enough to grow." Cade swallowed hard. The memory hit him harder than he expected. Before he could think further, Ranger froze. The dog stood near the center of the greenhouse, staring at the floor. Then slowly, deliberately, Ranger scratched once against the stone tiles beneath the vines, stopped, scratched again, then a third time. Cade's stomach tightened instantly. That was Ranger's signal. The same signal the dog had used years ago overseas whenever something hidden waited underground: weapons, explosives, bodies, and Cade moved closer carefully. The vines covering the floor were thick there, tangled around cracked stone slabs stained dark with age. Ranger backed away slightly but kept staring downward. Then the dog whimpered softly. Not fear. Recognition. Cade crouched slowly and pulled away the vines. Beneath them, half hidden under dirt and moss, was the outline of a wooden hatch built directly into the greenhouse floor. And attached to the rusted lock beneath it was a brass keyhole perfectly shaped for the key still sitting cold in Cade Whitmore's pocket. Cade Whitmore barely slept that night. The greenhouse changed after sunset. During the day, the broken glass and wild vines looked almost beautiful beneath the Montana sunlight. But at night, the structure groaned softly with every shift of cold wind outside. Metal beams clicked overhead. Branches scraped against the glass roof like fingertips searching for a way inside. Ranger stayed awake too. The German shepherd lay beside the old wooden hatch beneath the greenhouse floor, ears twitching at every sound. The dog's dark eyes kept drifting toward the basement stairs, as though something down there still held his attention. Cade sat at an overturned crate near the entrance, elbows resting on his knees. A battery lantern cast weak amber light across the abandoned structure. Shadows stretched long across broken planting tables and rusted gardening tools. In the silence, he unfolded Edgar's letter again. The paper smelled faintly of dust and cedar. The handwriting was steady despite the old man's age. The water beneath the lake keeps the ground alive longer than it should be. If the lines collapse, Northvale won't notice it first. Towns never notice slow deaths. Cade stared at the words for a long time. Then he folded the letter carefully and slipped it back into the tin box. He hated how much the place was getting inside his head already. By dawn, pale blue light seeped through the cracked glass overhead. The greenhouse looked softer in morning fog. Thin condensation clung to surviving panels, while early sunlight spilled across patches of moss and damp stone. And somehow, it smelled alive. Not abandoned, not rotten, alive. Ranger rose immediately when Cade grabbed his jacket. "You hungry?" Cade asked quietly. The dog wagged his tail once. That was practically excitement from Ranger. They drove back into Northvale just after sunrise. The diner near the center of town glowed warmly against the cold morning streets. A hand-painted sign above the door read, "Pike's Diner." Inside, heat and the smell of bacon wrapped around Cade the moment he entered. The woman behind the counter noticed him immediately. Eleanor Pike looked somewhere in her early 70s, though there was still surprising energy in the way she moved. She had short, white-gray hair tucked behind her ears and wore a cream cardigan beneath a faded brown diner apron dusted lightly with flour. Deep wrinkles framed her mouth, but her sharp blue eyes missed very little. She looked at Cade, then at Ranger, then back at Cade again. "You're Edgar's grandson," she said softly. Cade stopped halfway toward a booth. "You knew him?" Eleanor gave a quiet snort. "Honey, everybody in this town knew Edgar Whitmore." The way she said it wasn't mocking. It sounded tired, complicated. Cade slid into a booth while Ranger settled beside him on the floor. Several older men near the coffee counter glanced toward Cade with the cautious curiosity small towns reserved for outsiders. Eleanor poured coffee into a thick ceramic mug. "You staying long?" she asked. "Don't know yet." "Mm-hmm." That sound told Cade she didn't believe him. Eleanor leaned one hip against the counter. "Your grandfather used to come in every Thursday morning for blueberry pie and black coffee. Always smelled like wet soil and pine trees." A faint smile crossed her face. "Drove people crazy sometimes. But he wasn't a bad man." Cade stared down into the steam rising from his mug. My father disagreed." The old woman's expression dimmed slightly. "Your father and Edgar stopped understanding each other a long time ago." She said it gently. Not like gossip, like regret. Before Cade could answer, the diner door opened again. A woman stepped inside carrying 2 trays of seedling containers balanced carefully against her hip. She was in her mid-30s, lean and athletic from years of physical work rather than gym routines. Chestnut brown hair fell loose around the hood of a moss-green parka, and cold morning air had turned her cheeks pink. There was something grounded about her movements. Steady, efficient, practical. Her eyes landed on Cade. Then Ranger. The dog immediately lifted his head. "This him?" she asked Eleanor quietly. Eleanor nodded. "Mara Bellamy," the woman said, shifting the trays onto the counter before offering Cade a hand. "I run Bellamy Garden Supply." Cade shook it once. Her grip was stronger than expected. "You're staying at the greenhouse?" she asked. "For now." Mara studied him carefully, not flirtatiously, more like someone trying to decide whether he was another temporary problem heading toward town. "You know the roof's unstable in the east section?" Cade blinked slightly. "You've been there?" "Half this town's been there," she shrugged. "Most leave after one look." Cade almost answered. But Ranger suddenly stood. The German shepherd moved toward Mara's seedling trays and sniffed intensely near the bottom crate. Mara frowned. "What's he doing?" Ranger nudged one tray with his nose. A small folded cloth dropped onto the diner floor. Mara froze. Slowly, she bent down and picked it up. For a second, her expression changed completely. Not fear. Memory. The cloth was old, stained with dirt and faded green markings. A hand-sewn gardening tag. Eleanor looked surprised, too. "Well, I'll be damned," she whispered. Mara swallowed hard. "That belonged to my father." Silence settled over the booth. Cade frowned slightly. "You sure?" Mara nodded slowly while staring at the cloth in her hands. "My dad used to help Edgar repair irrigation lines outside town." Her voice softened unexpectedly. "He lost this years ago." Ranger sat quietly beside her now, watching. The moment lasted only seconds, but something shifted. Not just in Mara, in the room itself. Like the greenhouse had quietly reached into town and reminded someone it hadn't been forgotten yet. By late afternoon, Cade returned to the property carrying supplies from town. Canned food, lantern batteries, ropework gloves. A heavy tarp for the damaged roof section, Ranger jumped from the truck immediately and began patrolling the clearing again. The dog moved differently here, more alert, more invested. Cade noticed it every hour. Inside the greenhouse, sunlight poured through the cracked ceiling in long golden beams. Dust drifted through the air like floating ash. Cade spent most of the afternoon clearing debris from the western side. Dead vines snapped beneath his boots, while rusted tools clattered into piles against the wall. As he worked, memories kept surfacing. Edgar teaching him how to repot seedlings. Edgar letting him drink lemonade from mason jars during summer afternoons. Edgar silently covering young plants during unexpected frost while everyone else slept. The small memories. Quiet memories. The kind that hurt worse because Cade hadn't realized how long he'd buried them. Near evening, he discovered something strange behind a collapsed shelving unit. A line of pipes. Old copper irrigation pipes still running beneath the floor. Carefully installed, still intact. Cade crouched beside them, wiping dirt away with rough fingers. The metal felt cold. Then, warm. He frowned. That made no sense. The air outside was barely above freezing, yet faint warmth traveled through the pipes beneath the greenhouse floor. Ranger approached slowly beside him. The dog sniffed the pipe once, then looked toward the northern wall of the greenhouse, toward the lake beyond the trees. Cade followed the direction instinctively. For several seconds, neither of them moved. Wind rattled softly through the broken glass overhead, and then somewhere deep beneath the floor, a distant metallic sound echoed once through the pipes. Not loud, not threatening, just there. Cade's jaw tightened instantly, because for one terrible heartbeat, it sounded exactly like the hollow ringing of shell casings hitting concrete overseas. His breathing changed. Too fast, too shallow. Ranger reacted immediately. The German shepherd pressed firmly against Cade's leg, grounding him before the panic could fully take hold. Cade shut his eyes hard. The greenhouse blurred around him. Afghanistan flashed behind his eyes in fragments, burning metal radiostatic dust blood on his gloves. Then slowly, Ranger nudged his hand. Once, twice. Present. Not there. Here. Cade exhaled shakily and opened his eyes again. The greenhouse returned piece by piece. Broken glass, evening sunlight, cold Montana air. Not war. Not anymore. He rested one hand against Ranger's neck. You always know before I do, huh? The dog stared back quietly. Outside, the last sunlight touched the lake beyond the trees, and beneath the greenhouse floor. Warm water still moved through pipes built by a man Cade Whitmore was only beginning to understand. By the third week, the greenhouse no longer felt abandoned. It still looked broken from the outside. Half the roof remained patched with dark tarps that snapped softly in the mountain wind, and several window panels were cracked beyond repair. Wild ivy still wrapped around sections of the steel frame, like old fingers refusing to let go. But inside, something had changed. The air carried warmth now. Not much. Just enough to soften the cold spring mornings, enough that condensation formed across the surviving glass when sunlight touched the roof at dawn. Enough for things to grow. Cade Whitmore noticed it first in the silence. The greenhouse no longer sounded empty. There were small sounds now, the drip of water beneath old pipes, the scrape of Ranger's paws against stone, the faint rustle of leaves from surviving plants waking slowly beneath the light. Mariner, life returning always sounded quieter than death. Cade had begun sleeping deeper too. Not perfectly, but better. For the first time in years, he sometimes woke because sunlight hit his face instead of nightmares dragging him out of sleep with sweat cooling across his chest. The change unsettled him almost as much as the nightmares once had. That morning he stood near the western planting beds, wearing the same faded olive field jacket and dark cargo pants streaked with soil. His rough hands tightened around an old wrench while he studied the copper water lines running beneath the floor. Ranger lay nearby beneath a shaft of sunlight, watching him carefully. The German shepherd seemed calmer here, still alert, still disciplined, but calmer. Sometimes Cade caught the dog simply sitting in the warmth with his eyes half closed, like he was listening to something deeper than sound. "Ugh, you're turning soft," Cade muttered. Ranger thumped his tail once without opening his eyes. Cade smirked faintly. That counted as a conversation these days. Outside, wind moved through the birch trees surrounding the lake. Their pale trunks shimmered silver beneath the spring sun, while snowmelt trickled down the hillsides into shallow streams. Northvale looked beautiful in spring, which made it harder to believe the place was quietly dying. The lake water had dropped again since Cade first arrived. He noticed it yesterday while checking the old pipe outlets near the shoreline. Rocks that should have been underwater now sat exposed beneath the pale sky. Something underground was changing, and Edgar had known. That realization stayed with Cade constantly now. The old man hadn't been crazy. He had simply seen something everyone else ignored. The greenhouse door creaked open behind him. Mara Bellamy stepped inside carrying 2 cardboard trays balanced against her hip. She wore the same moss-green parka dusted lightly with soil around the sleeves, dark outdoor pants tucked into waterproof brown boots. Her chestnut hair was tied back loosely today, though strands kept escaping in the wind. She stopped when she saw Cade crouched beside the water pipes. "You're still alive," she said dryly. "Disappointed?" "Little bit." Cade gave the smallest hint of a smile. That alone surprised both of them. Mara set the trays down carefully. Seedlings, tomatoes, lettuce, early herbs. The smell of fresh soil spread immediately through the greenhouse. "You brought more plants? You keep watering the first ones wrong." She glanced toward a corner where several struggling seedlings leaned sideways in crooked pots. Figured I should intervene before you commit agricultural murder." Cade looked toward the plants. "I was in the Navy." "That explains everything." Ranger walked over to Mara and sniffed the trays carefully before sitting beside her boots. "You know," Mara said softly while scratching behind the dog's ears, "he likes this place." Cade glanced at Ranger. The dog's posture had changed completely since arriving here. The tension that usually sat across his shoulders had eased slightly, like the greenhouse calmed him too. That thought stayed with Cade longer than he expected. The afternoon passed with work. Mara showed Cade how to reinforce the planting beds, using salvaged cedar planks from the storage shed behind the greenhouse. Cade rebuilt broken supports while Mara sorted surviving plants from dead ones. They worked surprisingly well together, mostly because neither talked too much. At one point, Mara crouched beside an old irrigation valve half buried in moss. Her expression shifted slightly. "My father used to work on these," she said quietly. Cade looked over. "You said he helped Edgar?" "For a while." Mara brushed dirt across the metal wheel carefully. "Before the argument started?" She hesitated. "My dad fought wildfires around Northvale for 20 years. Edgar kept warning the town council that the underground spring system was weakening. Said the forest would dry out eventually if the water channels collapsed. And nobody listened." Mara shook her head slowly. "At first they did." Her voice softened. "Then the drought years ended. People stopped worrying. Edgar didn't." Cade leaned against the workbench quietly. "What happened between them?" Mara stared toward the lake outside. "One summer there was a bad fire near Miller's Ridge. My father blamed Edgar for refusing to let the county reroute part of the spring water." She folded her arms against the cold. "Said Edgar cared more about plants than people." The words landed heavily between them, because Cade had heard almost the exact same sentence from his own father years earlier. For a moment the greenhouse felt strangely smaller, filled with old anger that never fully disappeared. Then Ranger suddenly stood. The German shepherd moved toward the northern side of the greenhouse, where thick vines covered an entire wall of dusty glass. His ears lifted sharply. "What is it?" Cade asked quietly. Ranger didn't bark. He pressed forward slowly through the vines instead. Mara frowned. He's done that before? Usually when he smells something hidden. Together they followed him. The vines were dense there, twisted around rusted shelving and broken ceramic pots. Ranger pushed deeper until he disappeared behind the hanging ivy completely. Then, everything went quiet. Too quiet. Cade pulled the vines aside sharply and stopped cold. Behind the wall of overgrowth sat an entire hidden section of greenhouse, untouched by weather. The roof above it remained mostly intact. Sunlight poured cleanly through dusty glass onto rows of long dead planting tables. But one thing still lived there. A single white climbing rose. Its vines curled gently around rusted wire supports, blooming quietly beneath years of dust and neglect. Mara stared in disbelief. That's impossible. Cade stepped closer slowly. The flower looked fragile, yet stubbornly alive. Beneath it sat a small wooden sign barely visible beneath dirt. Mara wiped it clean carefully, her breath caught. Evelyn Rose, she whispered. Cade looked at her. What does that mean? Mara's eyes stayed fixed on the flower. My mother's name. Silence filled the greenhouse. Even Ranger remained still beside the rose. Mara swallowed hard. My father told me once Edgar planted a white rose here, the day my parents got married. Her voice trembled faintly now. I thought he was making it up. Neither of them spoke for a long moment, because suddenly the greenhouse no longer felt like a forgotten building. It felt personal, as like Edgar had spent years quietly tying pieces of the town together beneath all this glass and soil while nobody noticed. And somehow, the rose had waited. That evening, rain moved across the mountains, soft at first, then heavier against the greenhouse roof. Cade lit an old lantern near the workbench while Mara prepared coffee using a small camping stove she'd brought from town. Warm light flickered across steel beams overhead. Ranger slept beside the hidden rose section, one ear twitching occasionally at the sound of rain. Mara handed Cade a mug. You ever think about staying somewhere permanently? She asked suddenly. Cade stared into the coffee. No. That wasn't a very convincing answer. He leaned back against the workbench slowly. Places stopped feeling permanent after a while. Mara studied him carefully. There was no pity in her expression, only recognition, and like she understood more than she said. My mother forgets things now, she admitted quietly. Some days she remembers me. Some days she thinks I'm still 12 years old. She wrapped both hands around her mug. So I stayed here. Cade glanced at her. Out of guilt? Maybe. She smiled faintly. Maybe because somebody should. Rain continued tapping softly overhead. For a while neither of them spoke. Then Cade looked toward the hidden white rose again. How'd it survive this long? Mara followed his gaze. Some roots go deeper than people realize. Outside, thunder rolled softly beyond the mountains. Inside the greenhouse, lantern light reflected across old glass, while warm water still moved quietly beneath the floor. And for the first time in years, Cade Whitmore no longer felt like a man, simply passing through. The rain lasted 3 days. Not violent storms, just steady mountain rain drifting across North Vale in long gray curtains that wrapped the forest in mist. Water rolled down the cracked greenhouse panels and dripped softly into rusted buckets Cade had scattered beneath leaks in the roof. The place smelled different after rain, richer, wet cedar, moss, soil waking beneath warmth. Cade stood near the eastern wall one morning, tightening bolts along a warped support beam, while Ranger slept nearby beside a pile of old blankets. The German shepherd twitched occasionally in his sleep, paws jerking softly as if running through some dream only dogs remembered. The greenhouse had begun changing again, not dramatically, just little things. A section of ivy near the entrance had turned green instead of brown. Tiny shoots had appeared near one of the irrigation trenches, And the old apple trees in the hidden garden held tighter buds than before. Small signs. But Cade noticed every one, because for the first time in years, he was paying attention to things growing instead of things breaking. Outside, fog drifted low across the lake. Northvale itself seemed quieter lately, too. People had started waving when Cade drove through town now. Not warmly exactly, but differently. Like the strange veteran staying in Edgar Whitmore's greenhouse was slowly becoming part of the landscape instead of just passing through it. That unsettled Cade more than hostility ever could. Around noon, the sound of an old truck engine echoed up the gravel road toward the greenhouse. Ranger lifted his head instantly. A battered red pickup emerged through the trees and stopped beside Cade's truck. The driver climbed out slowly, moving stiffly like every joint hurt in cold weather. Walter Dunn. The old plumber looked exactly like someone who had spent 50 years working beneath sinks and inside frozen crawl spaces. Thick shoulders gone slightly soft with age. Heavy gray beard stained faintly yellow near the chin from decades of coffee and tobacco. Deep lines carved into his weathered face. He wore insulated overalls beneath an old flannel jacket and carried a rusted metal toolbox large enough to survive a war. Walter nodded once toward Cade. "Dogs still bite strangers?" "Only the rude ones." Walter grunted approvingly. "Good." Ranger sniffed the old man carefully before allowing himself to be scratched behind the ears. "That means he likes you," Cade said. Walter glanced toward the greenhouse. "Or he smells old pipe grease on me." The old plumber followed Cade inside and immediately stopped beneath the steel arches overhead. And even after weeks of work, the greenhouse still looked enormous inside. Rainwater slid slowly across dusty glass panels high above, while hanging vines swayed gently in the damp air. Walter removed his cap slowly. "Lord," he muttered under his breath. He looked almost emotional. Cade noticed it immediately. "You haven't been here in a while?" Walter gave a dry laugh. "Not since Edgar's funeral." "You came here after?" "Everybody did." Walter rubbed one hand through his beard. "Nobody stayed long." That sentence lingered strangely in the air. Walter spent the next hour inspecting the underground water system with Cade. Together they opened rusted floor panels and checked pressure valves buried beneath decades of dirt and roots. The deeper they traced the pipes, the quieter Walter became. Finally, he crouched beside one of the main copper lines and stared at the water flowing through it. "He actually did it," he whispered. Cade frowned. "Did what?" Walter leaned back slowly. "Your grandfather used to tell us the lake wasn't the real water source." He tapped the pipe gently. "Said there were thermal channels running beneath the mountain. Natural heated spring water." And nobody believed him. Walter snorted. "Most folks in town thought Edgar was half crazy by the end." Cade tightened his jaw slightly. "But not you." The old plumber looked toward the hidden garden section beyond the vines. "No," he admitted quietly. "Not me." Rain tapped steadily overhead. Then Walter sighed heavily and lowered himself onto an old crate. "There's something you should probably know." Cade stayed silent. Walter stared toward the lake beyond the greenhouse windows. "About 15 years ago, the county wanted to build a drainage cut near Miller's Ridge. Faster runoff. Better roads." He paused. Edgar fought it harder than anybody. Why? Because he believed the drainage would break the underground water pressure feeding the springs. Cade folded his arms. "And?" Walter's expression darkened. "They built it anyway." The greenhouse suddenly felt colder. Walter rubbed both hands together slowly. Couple years later, lake started dropping. Neither man spoke for several seconds, because suddenly the dying shoreline outside no longer looked natural. It looked man-made. Later that afternoon, Mara arrived carrying folders protected beneath her jacket from the rain. Her boots splashed through mud as she entered the greenhouse. "Oh, you two look miserable," she said. Been digging through Edgar's pipe cemetery all morning, Walter muttered. Mara handed Cade several old maps spread inside plastic sleeves. I found these in storage at Town Hall. Cade unfolded the papers carefully across an old gardening table. Survey maps, water flow records, land assessments, many signed by Edgar Whitmore. Others stamped "Denied" in thick red ink. Mara crossed her arms. My father used to keep copies hidden in our garage. Her eyes stayed fixed on the maps. I never understood why. Walter looked uncomfortable suddenly. There were arguments back then, he admitted. Ugly ones. About the lake? About money. That got Cade's attention. Walter scratched his beard slowly. Tourism investors wanted easier road access around the water. County council wanted development. Edgar kept saying construction near the ridge would damage the spring pressure underground. Mara looked at him sharply. And my father? Walter hesitated too long. That alone answered enough. Mara's face changed immediately. Not anger, hurt. You knew he agreed with Edgar. Walter exhaled heavily. He did. Quietly. The old man looked down at his rough hands. But your father had a family to feed. People around here stopped listening to Edgar because he never compromised. Your dad... Walter swallowed once. Your dad tried to survive both sides. Silence settled heavily across the greenhouse. Rainwater trickled somewhere in the distance. Ranger slowly walked toward Mara and sat beside her without a sound. The woman stared at the old survey maps, while one hand rested unconsciously against the dog's neck. Then suddenly, Ranger's ears lifted sharply. The dog stood. Every muscle tightened. Cade noticed immediately. What is it? Ranger moved toward the southern wall of the greenhouse, where old gardening shelves leaned crookedly beneath hanging tools. He stopped beside a narrow wooden cabinet, half hidden beneath canvas tarps. Then he barked once. Short, sharp. Not fear. Alert. Cade pulled the tarp aside carefully. The cabinet doors were swollen from moisture, barely opening at first. When he finally forced them apart, a stack of dusty cassette tapes spilled onto the floor. Mara crouched beside them. Each tape had handwritten labels. Water levels, March 1998. Ridge flow tests, council meeting. And one final tape simply marked, for Cade. The entire greenhouse went still. Walter stared at the tape like he'd seen a ghost. He recorded everything, the old plumber whispered. Cade picked up the cassette slowly. His name written in Edgar's handwriting hit harder than expected. Because suddenly this didn't feel like random memories left behind anymore. It felt intentional. Like Edgar knew someday somebody would need proof. Or answers. Or both. That evening, the rain finally stopped. Cold sunset light filtered through wet glass panels, turning the greenhouse gold from the inside. Water droplets shimmered across the vines while distant fog rolled slowly above the lake. Walter had already left. Mara remained seated near the workbench, quietly organizing the old survey maps into piles. Cade stood near the hidden garden, holding the cassette tape in one hand. Ranger lay nearby, watching both of them. You gonna listen to it? Mara asked softly. Eventually. You nervous? Cade gave a faint, humorless smile. Little late to stop now. Mara studied him carefully. You know, she said quietly, for somebody who planned on selling this place, you've rebuilt half of it already. Cade looked around slowly. The patched roof, the cleaned pathways, the warm lantern glow against old steel, the living plants. Then he looked toward the lake outside. No, he said after a long silence. Not rebuilt. He glanced down at the cassette tape again. Just trying to figure out what got broken. Outside, evening settled over Northvale. And beneath the greenhouse floor, Warm water still flowed through forgotten pipes, built by a man the town had misunderstood for far too long. Winter arrived early in Northvale. Not gently. The first storm rolled over the mountains in late November, with a sky the color of steel and winds that screamed through the pine forest hard enough to bend entire trees. Snow buried the roads overnight. The lake vanished beneath drifting white fog, and the greenhouse, despite everything Cade had repaired, suddenly looked fragile again, like a wounded thing trying to survive another season. By morning, half the eastern roof was gone. Cade stood inside the greenhouse, staring upward, while snow blew through shattered glass panels in long white ribbons. Ice covered the planting beds. Several young tomato vines had frozen solid during the night, their leaves blackened and curling inward like burned paper. The warmth beneath the floors was fading too. The underground water lines still worked in places, but the damaged channels near the lake weren't carrying enough pressure anymore. Everything Edgar built was slowly losing the fight. Cade rubbed both hands across his face, exhaustion sinking deeper into his bones with every passing day. His beard had grown rougher over the past month, and dark circles lived permanently beneath his blue-gray eyes now. He barely recognized himself anymore. Not because he looked different, because he cared. That was the dangerous part. Ranger moved carefully through the greenhouse, avoiding broken glass as if he understood exactly how fragile the place had become. Snowflakes clung to the German shepherd's thick black and tan fur while he inspected the damaged planting beds one by one. Then the dog stopped beside a dead row of seedlings and simply sat down, watching. Cade looked away first. The storm lasted 4 days. Roads closed. Power failed twice in town. The greenhouse survived only because Cade refused to leave it alone. He hauled snow off weakened roof sections until his shoulders burned. He patched broken panels with spare tarp and scrap wood while freezing wind cut through his jacket. At night he kept the old wood stove burning with salvaged cedar boards from the collapsed storage shed. Still, plants continued dying. One morning, Cade walked into the hidden garden section and found 2 of the surviving grapevines frozen through. Something inside him finally cracked. He grabbed a clay pot from the workbench and hurled it across the greenhouse. The sound exploded through the structure. Shards scattered across the frozen floor. Ranger immediately stood. Cade pressed both hands against the workbench, breathing hard. "Maybe this place is dead for a reason," he muttered bitterly. Outside, snow hammered against the glass. Inside, silence swallowed the room again. Then Ranger walked toward him slowly. Not nervous, not comforting, steady. The dog stopped beside Cade and rested his head against the man's knee with quiet certainty, like an old soldier refusing to abandon another one. Cade shut his eyes. For several seconds he couldn't speak at all, because the truth was, he wasn't angry about the greenhouse. He was terrified of failing something that mattered again. That feeling followed him long after the storm ended. The next morning, Ranger disappeared. At first, Cade assumed the dog had gone outside briefly like usual. But after several minutes passed without seeing him return, something cold settled in his stomach. He grabbed his coat and stepped into knee-deep snow. "Ranger!" Only wind answered. Panic rose faster than he expected. The forest around the lake looked completely different beneath heavy snow. Tree branches sagged low under ice, and old trails had vanished beneath white drifts. Cade moved quickly along the shoreline, boots breaking through crusted snow while his breath burned in the freezing air. "Ranger!" Still nothing. Then, movement. Far ahead near the northern edge of the lake. The German shepherd stood beside a collapsed section of earth near the shoreline, barking sharply toward the water. Cade pushed through the snow toward him and stopped cold. Part of the frozen shoreline had caved inward during the storm. Beneath the broken ice and mud lay a massive underground structure of stone channels and steel pipes buried beneath the earth. An entire hidden water system. Even beneath layers of ice, warm water still rushed through parts of it. Cade stared in disbelief. The system stretched farther beneath the lake than he ever imagined. This wasn't irrigation for one greenhouse. This was infrastructure. Engineering. Edgar Whitmore had spent decades building a hidden network designed to regulate heat and water pressure beneath the entire valley. Ranger barked again near a broken steel gate buried in the mud. Cade knelt beside it, brushing snow away with numb hands. Stamped faintly into the rusted metal were the words, Northvale Thermal Channel, Phase 1. His pulse slowed, then quickened again, because suddenly Edgar's obsession made terrible sense. The old man hadn't been protecting a garden. He'd been trying to protect the water beneath the mountain itself. By afternoon, Cade drove into town covered in snow and mud. Mara spotted him immediately when he entered Bellamy Garden Supply. The small shop smelled of fertilizer, cedar mulch, and dried lavender hanging from ceiling beams. Warm yellow lights reflected softly against old wooden shelves filled with seed packets and ceramic pots. Mara looked up from behind the counter and froze. "You look awful." "Thanks. No, seriously. You look like you fought a bear." Bear might have won. Despite herself, she smiled slightly. Then her expression changed when she saw his face. Something serious had happened. Cade spread several soaked survey sketches across the counter. Mara leaned closer. "Well, what is this?" "Your father and Edgar weren't arguing over a greenhouse," Cade said quietly. "They were arguing over this." He pointed toward the diagrams. Underground thermal routes, pressure channels, lake-fed circulation systems. Mara stared at the pages silently, then slowly sat down. "My God," Cade nodded once. The drainage project damaged the main pressure flow. Outside, snow drifted past the windows. Inside the little shop, the entire story of Northvale suddenly felt different. Mara looked pale now. "Do you realize what this means?" Cade did. If the thermal channels failed completely, the lake would continue shrinking, soil temperatures around the valley would collapse, wildfire seasons would worsen farms. Near Northvale could eventually fail during colder winters. Edgar hadn't been paranoid. He had simply seen the future earlier than everyone else. Mara looked up slowly, and nobody listened. Cade glanced toward the falling snow outside. "No," he said quietly. They just got tired of hearing him. That evening, Mara followed Cade back to the greenhouse. The storm clouds had finally begun clearing, revealing pale blue twilight over the frozen forest. Smoke drifted from the greenhouse chimney into the cold evening sky, while lantern light glowed softly behind the dusty glass walls. Inside, Ranger slept near the stove, wrapped in warmth and exhaustion. Mara crouched beside him, gently brushing melting snow from the dog's fur. "He found it," she whispered. Cade nodded. He knew where to look before I did. The greenhouse felt strangely peaceful tonight, despite the damage. Broken, but alive. Cade placed Edgar's old survey maps across the main work table while Mara studied the thermal system diagrams again. Then she stopped suddenly at one corner of the page. There's another line." Cade looked closer. A second route extended beneath the western ridge outside town. Different handwriting circled it in faded red pencil. If pressure drops here, entire system collapses. Silence settled between them. Outside, the frozen lake reflected moonlight beneath the clearing sky. Inside the greenhouse, Cade finally understood the weight Edgar carried all those years. Not the weight of protecting plants. The weight of watching an entire town slowly damage the thing keeping it alive. Ranger lifted his head sleepily near the stove and looked toward Cade. And for the first time since arriving in Northvale, Cade no longer wondered whether he should leave. Now he wondered whether there was still enough time left to save any of it. The first people arrived quietly, not with speeches, not with apologies, just boots crunching through snow beneath gray December skies. Cade Whitmore was outside near the damaged eastern frame early one morning when he heard the sound of another truck climbing the frozen road toward the greenhouse. He expected Walter. Instead, 3 unfamiliar men stepped out carrying lumber across their shoulders. All 3 were veterans. Cade recognized it immediately, not from uniforms. None of them wore military clothing anymore. It was the posture, the way they scanned surroundings automatically without realizing it, the way silence sat comfortably between them, the way tiredness lived behind their eyes even while they joked. The oldest was a broad-shouldered man in his late 50s named Travis Reed, and he had rough silver stubble, heavy brows, and the thick scar of an old burn stretching along one side of his neck. Years earlier, an explosion inside a military transport vehicle had left him partially deaf in one ear. Now, he repaired logging equipment outside town and rarely spoke unless necessary. Beside him stood Micah Boone, younger, maybe late 30s, tall and narrow with dark skin weathered by cold mountain winters. He wore an old Marine Corps beanie pulled low over tired eyes and carried himself with quiet patience. Micah had lost his younger brother to addiction after the war. Since then, he fixed roofs, fences, and anything else that kept his hands busy enough to quiet his thoughts. The third man looked barely 40, though hardship had aged him harder than time. Nolan Pierce had sharp cheekbones, rough blonde stubble, and a permanent limp from a shattered knee in Kandahar years ago. He grinned constantly in the way some damaged people learn to survive. Travis nodded toward the broken greenhouse frame. "Heard you could use extra hands?" Cade stared at them a moment. "Walter sent you?" "Nope," Nolan said. "Your dog did." Cade frowned slightly. Nolan pointed toward Ranger, who stood beside the doorway, watching the men calmly. "That dog came into town yesterday. Sat outside Walter's shop for 20 minutes until somebody followed him back here." Nolan shrugged. "Felt rude not to show up." Cade looked at Ranger. The German shepherd simply blinked. Like this was obvious. For the first time in years, laughter echoed inside the greenhouse before noon. Real laughter. Not forced. Not polite. The kind that arrived unexpectedly between tired people who understood each other without explanation. The sound startled Cade more than silence ever had. Over the next week, the greenhouse transformed again. Walter repaired damaged water valves while muttering constantly about idiots who don't respect pipe pressure. Mara organized winter seedlings beside the hidden garden section. Her moss green parka dusted with soil and sawdust almost daily now. Eleanor Pike arrived every afternoon, carrying enough food for twice the number of people there. Old people survive winter by feeding everybody else, she declared whenever Cade tried refusing help. The greenhouse slowly filled with warmth, not just heat, life. The smell of fresh soup drifted through the steel corridors beside cedar smoke from the wood stove. Lanterns glowed softly against repaired glass, while boots stomped snow from the floors near the entrance. Even Ranger changed. The German shepherd moved constantly between people like a quiet guardian, checking each corner of the greenhouse. Sometimes Cade caught the dog simply sitting near the stove, watching everyone with calm alertness, ears twitching at familiar voices. Like Ranger had accepted this place as his territory too. One afternoon, while replacing frozen pipe brackets beneath the northern floor panels, Cade discovered a rusted metal bar hidden inside the wall cavity. At first he assumed it held old repair tools. Instead, photographs, dozens of them, some damaged by moisture, others perfectly preserved inside wax paper. Cade sat heavily against the wall beneath a yellow lantern light, while snow drifted softly outside the glass roof. His hands froze on one photograph, and an 8-year-old boy sat cross-legged inside the greenhouse beside Edgar Whitmore. small hands dirty with soil. A clay flower pot balanced carefully in his lap. The boy smiled openly at the camera. Cade barely recognized himself. Edgar sat beside him, wearing the same worn brown canvas jacket Cade remembered from childhood. The old man looked younger there, stronger. One large hand rested quietly against Cade's shoulder. On the back of the photograph, Edgar had written, "One day, this place will need him more than me." Cade stared at the sentence for a very long time. The greenhouse around him blurred slightly, because suddenly memories returned all at once. Summer mornings carrying soil bags beside Edgar, the smell of tomato vines warming beneath sunlight, Edgar teaching him how roots spread beneath frozen ground even during winter. Not lectures, not grand lessons, just quiet moments, moments Cade forgot he still carried. For years Cade believed Edgar chose plants over family. But sitting there beneath warm lantern light while snow covered the mountains outside, another truth slowly settled inside him. Maybe Edgar built the greenhouse because he hoped someone broken might someday need it. Maybe he built it for Cade long before either of them understood why. That evening, the storm clouds finally cleared. The sky above North Vale darkened into deep blue crystal, while fresh snow reflected moonlight across the forest. Smoke curled upward from the greenhouse chimney into the freezing air. Inside, the repaired eastern roof glowed gold beneath rows of hanging lanterns. Then Ranger suddenly stood. The German shepherd walked toward the front entrance slowly, ears lifted. "What is it?" Micah asked quietly. Before anyone moved, headlights appeared through the trees. One truck, then another, then several more. Cade stepped toward the doorway in confusion. People from North Vale emerged carrying boxes, extension cords, old holiday decorations, spare blankets, and food containers wrapped in towels. Families, children, elderly couples, even people Cade barely recognized from town. At the center of them stood Eleanor Pike holding a tangled box of ancient Christmas lights against her chest. Well?" she snapped at Cade. "You planning on standing there all night or helping us?" Cade blinked. "What is this?" Eleanor looked genuinely offended. "It's Christmas Eve," as if that explained everything. Maybe it did. Within an hour, the greenhouse transformed completely. Old yellow string lights wrapped around steel beams overhead. Pine garlands hung beside repaired windows. Someone placed a tiny cedar tree beside the hidden garden section, decorated with handmade ornaments and dried orange slices. Children laughed while chasing Ranger between planting beds. The dog tolerated it with exhausted dignity. At one point, a little girl no older than 6 wrapped both arms around Ranger's neck while whispering secrets into his fur. The German shepherd sat perfectly still through the entire conversation. Mara stood beside Cade near the workbench, watching the scene unfold. She said softly, "people haven't gathered here like this since I was a kid." Cade looked around slowly. Warm lantern light reflected against snowy glass panels overhead. Laughter drifted through the greenhouse. Steam rose from Eleanor's soup pots. For the first time in decades, the place no longer looked haunted. It looked alive. Then Mara touched Cade's arm gently. He looked down. She handed him another photograph from Edgar's box. This one showed a much younger Edgar standing outside the greenhouse during winter, beside a handwritten wooden sign. The sign read, "When the lights come back, people will too." Cade felt his throat tighten unexpectedly, because somehow Edgar had known. Not exactly how, not exactly when, but he knew this place would matter again someday. And maybe that belief was what kept him building even after everybody else stopped listening. At late that night, after the last truck disappeared down the snowy road, and silence finally returned to the mountains, Cade sat alone beside the wood stove. Ranger slept nearby beneath the glow of fading Christmas lights. Snow drifted quietly beyond the glass walls. The greenhouse creaked softly around them, warm against the frozen world outside. Cade leaned back in the chair slowly, then closed his eyes. And for the first time since the war, he slept without dreaming of it. No gunfire, no burning metal, no dead voices waiting in darkness. Only warmth, only quiet, only the soft breathing of a loyal dog sleeping nearby while yellow light reflected gently across old glass built by a man who never stopped believing someone would eventually come home. Winter finally loosened its grip on Northvale in slow, quiet ways. Snow retreated first from the southern hillsides where sunlight lingered longest. Then patches of dark earth appeared beside the roads. The frozen lake cracked softly at night like old glass waking from sleep, and cold streams began running again beneath the pine forest. By March, the mountains smelled different. Wet soil, cedar bark, new grass hidden beneath melting frost. And high above the trees, the Whitmore glass garden glowed beneath spring sunlight like something reborn. The greenhouse no longer looked abandoned from the road. The steel arches had been repaired and repainted in weathered dark green. New glass panels reflected the morning sky, while ivy climbed carefully restored frames instead of swallowing them whole. The warm lanterns still hung from the beams overhead, though now they blended naturally beside rows of healthy plants and flowering vines. Life had returned fully, not perfectly, but honestly. Cade Whitmore stood outside the front entrance one cool morning, holding a wooden sign across his knees, while Ranger rested beside him in the grass. The German shepherd had shed much of his heavy winter coat. Sunlight warmed the black and tan fur across his back, while children's laughter drifted faintly from inside the greenhouse. Cade stared down at the unfinished lettering carved into the wood. His rough hands looked different now, still scarred, still hard. But dirt lived permanently beneath his fingernails these days, instead of engine grease or gunpowder residue. The realization hit him unexpectedly. He no longer woke every morning preparing for survival. Sometimes he woke wondering whether the tomatoes needed watering first. That thought should have embarrassed him. Instead, it felt strangely peaceful. Behind him, the greenhouse doors opened. Mara Bellamy stepped outside carrying a tray of lavender seedlings balanced against one hip. Her chestnut hair caught golden sunlight as wind moved softly through the loose strands around her face. Months of work inside the greenhouse had added freckles across her cheeks and faded the constant tension that once lived behind her brown eyes. She stopped beside Cade. "You've been staring at that sign for 20 minutes. Thinking. That usually worries people." Cade smirked faintly. Mara glanced down at the carved words. Whitmore Glass Garden. Simple. Nothing fancy. Exactly the kind of name Edgar would have chosen. "You nervous?" she asked quietly. A little." Mara looked through the glass walls behind them where people already moved between planting beds. "You rebuilt an entire greenhouse through winter storms." She nudged his shoulder lightly. "I think you can survive opening day." Cade wasn't so sure, because opening the greenhouse to people felt different than repairing it. Repairing things made sense. People were harder. By noon, cars lined the dirt road leading toward the lake. Northvale showed up slowly at first, then all at once. Families walked through the greenhouse entrance carrying homemade bread, gardening gloves, seed trays, folding chairs, and old photographs of the town from decades earlier. Elderly couples wandered carefully through the warm glass corridors, while children chased sunlight across the stone pathways. The place breathed now. Laughter echoed beneath steel beams once buried in silence, and lavender bloomed along the central walkway beside rows of fresh herbs and climbing tomatoes. The hidden white rose still curled quietly around its wire frame, near the northern wall, while the old apple trees finally carried small pale blossoms for the first time in years. Near the western planting beds, Travis Reed and Micah Boone helped several younger veterans assemble raised garden boxes from reclaimed cedar lumber. Nobody gave speeches about healing, They just worked, which somehow helped more. One veteran named Owen Mercer spent most of the afternoon repairing broken wheelbarrows near the tool shed. He was a thin man in his 60s with trembling hands and tired eyes softened by kindness. Years of untreated trauma and too much whiskey had hollowed him out before Northvale slowly pulled him back together. Now he taught local teenagers how to sharpen tools properly while pretending not to enjoy it. Nearby, Eleanor Pike served soup and fresh bread from a folding table decorated with yellow wildflowers. "You feed enough people," she declared loudly, "and eventually they start acting human again." Nobody argued with her. Not even Cade. Especially not Cade. Because every time he looked around the greenhouse, he felt something dangerous growing inside him. Belonging. Mid-afternoon sunlight poured through the repaired ceiling in warm golden sheets. Ranger moved slowly through the crowd like a silent shepherd, accepting careful scratches from children while keeping one eye constantly on Cade. At one point, a small boy wandered away from the main gathering toward the hidden garden section. Cade noticed him immediately. The child couldn't have been older than 8. Thin, brown-haired, freckles scattered across pale cheeks. He wore an oversized flannel jacket that clearly belonged to an older brother or father. The boy stopped beside Edgar's photograph, hanging near the central work table. For a long moment he stared at it silently. Then he looked up at Cade. Was he the man who built this place? The question settled softly into the greenhouse air. Nearby conversations faded slightly. Cade looked at Edgar's photograph, then around the greenhouse itself, at the living plants, at the repaired steel beams, at Ranger lying calmly among children beneath sunlight, at Mara laughing quietly with Eleanor beside the lavender beds. And suddenly Cade understood something he'd been too angry to see before. Edgar hadn't built the greenhouse to escape people. He built it because he believed people needed places worth returning to. Cade looked back at the boy. "No," he said quietly. "He's the man who saved it." The boy smiled faintly before running back toward the others. But the words stayed with Cade long after. Late that afternoon came the moment nobody expected. Ranger suddenly stood from his place near the entrance. Not alert, not tense, just focused. The German shepherd walked slowly through the greenhouse toward the hidden garden section where the white rose climbed beneath sunlight. Several people noticed. Children followed quietly behind him. Then Ranger stopped beneath the apple trees. He sat down and stared toward the glass ceiling overhead. At first, nothing happened. Then, a single apple blossom drifted loose from the branches above. It floated slowly through warm sunlight before landing directly beside Edgar's old photograph on the table nearby. Nobody spoke. Not because they believed in ghosts, but because the moment felt strangely intentional. Mara looked toward Cade silently. Even Eleanor seemed affected. The old diner owner wiped quickly at one eye before pretending to rearrange soup bowls. Ranger simply remained seated beneath the blooming trees, calm and watchful, as though he understood something nobody else fully could. The greenhouse stayed quiet several seconds longer than normal. Then life resumed again. Children laughed. Lanterns swayed softly overhead. But the feeling lingered. Not haunting, blessing. As evening settled over Northvale, warm yellow lights flickered alive throughout the greenhouse once more. The glass walls glowed against the darkening forest, exactly the way Edgar must have imagined years earlier. Only now the place was full. Not with plants, with people. Cade stood near the entrance, holding the finished wooden sign while Mara joined him beneath the hanging lanterns. He lifted the sign carefully and secured it beside the greenhouse doors. The carved words read, "Nothing grows where people stop caring." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The greenhouse behind them hummed softly with voices and warmth. Then Mara smiled. Not teasing this time. Gentle. Looks like you were wrong. Cade looked toward her, then toward Ranger stretched lazily among exhausted children beside the lavender beds, then toward the old greenhouse glowing alive against the spring night. And slowly, for the first time in many years, the ache inside his chest no longer felt empty. It felt planted, like something deep beneath frozen ground had finally decided to grow again. Sometimes, the miracle God sends into our lives does not arrive as wealth, success, or an easy road. Sometimes it arrives as one loyal dog who refuses to give up on us. Sometimes it arrives as a forgotten place that teaches us how to live again. And sometimes it arrives through the quiet kindness of ordinary people who show up when we need them most. Cade believed his life had already been broken beyond repair. But God often works through the things the world overlooks. An abandoned greenhouse, a buried spring beneath frozen ground, a second chance hidden inside pain. Maybe that's how grace works. Not always through lightning or grand signs, but through small acts of care repeated day after day until something dead begins to grow again. And maybe someone watching this tonight needed that reminder. No matter how lost you feel, no matter how long winter has lasted in your life, God is still able to grow something beautiful in places that seem forgotten. Thank you for spending this time with us and becoming part of this journey. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who may need hope today. Leave a comment telling us where you are watching from or what part of the story stayed with you the most. And if you enjoy stories about loyalty, healing, faith, and second chances, subscribe to Veteran Dog Stories so you never miss the next journey. May God bless you, protect your home, bring peace to your heart, and watch over the people and animals you love. And wherever life takes you next, may you always find a place where something good can still grow.